When you hop into any modern AAA game and take a look around you, you'll see just how far the gaming industry has come when it comes to realism in graphics. You take a trip to the forests and mountains in Red Dead Redemption 2, for example, look at how the light dances around the environments and people, and it looks so incredible it's almost like you're there. At their peak, games like this can get so immersive that it almost feels like the next logical step in immersion is actually being able to feel, smell and taste the games. We've reached this peak of realism quite a while ago already. It's been almost 5 years after the release of RDR2, and it feels like you can't really get much more realistic than this for the average gamer, unless either VR becomes more accessible or we actually make smell-o-vision into a real thing. I grew up around the era when most new games already had 3D graphics. My first console that I owned was the PS2, so I never really personally experienced that dimensional leap in games from 2D to 3D, which I imagine felt insane at the time for those people who did. To me, the three-dimensionality of games was nothing out of the ordinary, and when I did play 2D games, they didn't feel any less advanced since I had gotten used to them simultaneously along with the newer games. But after being used to the graphics of the earlier 3D games through playing with my friend on his Nintendo 64, playing Final Fantasy X and seeing the cinematics for the first time blew my child mind. Even though it's a little anime, I couldn't comprehend just how real and vivid everything looked. The details in the water, the fluid movement, and the micro adjustments in the facial expressions of the characters were something that I had never experienced in a game before, and it legitimately felt like the future. And to think that this game was released 22 years ago in 2001. Now, I know that these cutscenes were pre-rendered, and it's not really the same thing as real-time graphics, but for the child me, it made no difference, since this was a game and it looked almost real. But beyond the initial wow factor, do realistic graphics really add that much to the experience? When you are reading a book, a medium with no graphics, you get to experience the story's visuals by your own terms. Your imagination makes it up just the way you want it to be, as there is no visual reference point given to you by the source material. A similar thing, albeit to a lesser extent, happens when you play a game with minimal graphics. What the game lacks in details, your mind makes up for with your imagination. As an example, a game like Disco Elysium, a game that I love, made me feel more immersed than almost any realistic AAA game, despite its story being told mostly via text and still character portraits in an isometric painting-esque world. On the other hand, when a game does have all of the realistic details that you could imagine, and the less ambiguity it has in its visuals, it can leave less space for your imagination to craft your own experience. But who cares, dude? Games used to look like this, and now they look like actual real life. Isn't it obviously better now? Well, to answer this question, I want to in the first place explore the purpose of graphics. The reason why graphics are there to begin with is to visually display what is happening within the game, so you can see what is happening. I know, you can thank me for sharing this super insightful observation, but what are so-called good graphics? Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you with a somewhat boring answer, but it's subjective. Beauty is in the eye of the gamer, and beyond personal preference, the developer might favor different levels of detail and different styles of presentation to tell their story in the way that they want it to be experienced. I'll come back to that point later, but when people talk about the goodness of graphics, what they usually mean is the amount of detail and realism in the visual presentation of the game. How many polygons were used in the creation of the objects and characters? The more polygons, the more realistic, and the more realistic, the better the graphics are. And this mindset can be seen in most modern AAA games since around the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 days, with these massive game studios pumping out more and more lifelike and more graphically demanding games one after the other, while the more stylized and more artistically driven games were left in the hands of the indie developers. It feels like, with the release of new generations of graphics cards and consoles, these game studios with endless pockets rush to create the most hyper-realistic video game experiences that they are able to, with more polygons that you could imagine, every single time the commonly used hardware improves its graphical capabilities. You can see this in some very recent games as well, like with Forspoken, which goes for an insane level of graphical detail in its environments, and Horizon Forbidden West, which was so realistic it had incels losing it over tiny hairs on the main character's face. But to be honest with you, even though these games look great, despite the hype that realistic graphics seems to bring, and these games do sell crazy numbers, I have to question, have graphics really progressed that much in the last 20 plus years since the release of Final Fantasy X, whose cutscenes still would look fantastic even if it was released today? I mean, if we look at the timeline starting from 20 years before the release of Final Fantasy X, we went from NES graphics to the 16-bit and then to the 32-bit era into this in just 20 years. And now we've gone from realistic graphics to slightly more realistic graphics in the last 20 years. And I am aware that during the 2000s to 2010s PS3 era, we made some pretty big leaps in terms of in-game graphics as well, like in Crysis. But all in all, I feel like the improvements after that have been pretty marginal. This trend of chasing realism has now brought us to the point where the market for the game with realistic graphics has become very saturated over the past 10 to 15 years, and this in turn has made the effects of aggressively going for realism in games more and more apparent. At the conceptual level, realism is a safe art style. It's pretty much as inoffensive as it gets, since you're literally trying to visually recreate real life, which means that there is no space for making fundamental artistic changes that would make the game less realistic. Now, I'm not talking about the contents of the game per se. Of course, a game could still have things that don't exist in the real world in it, but in terms of visuals, you're rarely making big risky decisions, and instead you decide to build your story from a blank slate with little to no artistic flair to change things up. This, at the surface level, makes these games kind of boring to me. The style of the game isn't adding anything to the experience, and instead the game requires its other elements, story, voice acting, world building, and gameplay mechanics, to work overtime in order to bring enough substance to the game. And the reason I feel this tends to make them boring is because more often than not, they just fail to do that, at least in some of the aspects. And when looking through a catalog of dozens of roughly same looking games, none of them visually stand out or even pique my interest in the first place. As an example, a lot of those often criticized Ubisoft open world games fall into this trap with their boring and handholdy to-do list simulator gameplay. When the rest of the game is already kind of lacking, the lack of creativity in the presentation isn't doing them any favors. Think about this through the lens of photorealistic art for a moment. As someone who is awful at drawing, it's immensely impressive to see someone create a piece of art that is so realistic that it's indistinguishable from an actual photograph. But while honing your craft to the point where you're able to, in a sense, print the thing that you're seeing with your eyes by using your hands, seeing the 1000th realistic eye drawing doesn't really make me feel anything beyond admiration for the technical ability of the artist. Now, this doesn't mean that photorealism is inherently less impactful. It just requires the subject of the art to carry the meaning, the substance of it to its viewer. The same thing is true with games. Good graphics by themselves are not enough. I know everybody loves dunking on the soullessness of modern AAA titles, and not to beat a dead horse, but the lack of strong artistic direction in a lot of these games is not doing them any favors in beating the soulless allegations. Like, come on guys, you have the ability and funding to tell your story in any way that you could possibly imagine, and 9 times out of 10, you choose to make it look like the same thing that you see when you open your eyes. Just good old, bland, unseasoned chicken breast ass reality. Like I mentioned earlier, as a concept, reality is safe. But outside of the conceptual level, it can actually be kind of risky when it comes to the execution. By having realism as a goal, you're giving the person playing the game a kind of unrealistic reference point to which the game is undoubtedly going to be compared to, which is real life. And while games are pretty good at creating beautiful and realistic landscapes, when it comes to making people look like well, people instead of human skin wearing aliens or awkwardly moving waxy statues, it misses the mark pretty often. The uncanny valley is a phenomenon that appears when something looks pretty human but just isn't quite there, which causes the observer to experience feelings of uneasiness and overall yuckiness. And a lot of the realistic games that don't quite manage to do faces and people correctly risk having this uncanny effect break the immersion of the game. One of the most infamous examples of this is of course Mass Effect Andromeda, but even some super recent games like Forspoken and Hogwarts do end up crossing the boundary of realistic and uncanny at times. And you don't even have to dig that deep to find an awkward uncanny valley moment in these games, like for example this, which is one of the images they are using to sell Hogwarts on the PS Store, and I doubt that they genuinely meant to make this thing look as demonic as it does. While this stuff is usually nightmare fuel, it would be really interesting to see a game studio, in a case like this, lean into the uncanny valley in some way that fits the story that the game is trying to tell. To show you what I mean, I'm going to go on a quick tangent on 3D anime for a moment, so please bear with me. 3D or CGI animation in anime used to look pretty awful in the past, especially when it came to animating people. The movements were too rigid to feel natural, and the people in general looked kind of plasticky and stiff. There was one show, however, that took those shortcomings of the technology into consideration and made it work in its own way, and that is the 2017 anime Land of the Lustrous, which was entirely animated in 3D. This show makes the jankiness of the animation style work because all of the characters in it are literally made out of stone. This combination of the story that is being told and the choice of style complement each other so well that all the aspects of 3D animation that would have usually been considered flaws, like unnatural stiffness and awkward movement, turn into advantages that are used to tell the story in a more effective way. Nowadays, this technology has evolved a lot since then, and this is rarely an issue anymore. But I wanted to bring it up as an example of how a visual weakness like this can be turned into a strength with some out-of-the-box thinking. In the gaming world, I've pretty much never seen the uncanniness of almost realistic faces used in a way like this. Detroit Become Human kind of did this in its own way. In the game, a lot of the characters are sentient AI robots, and the slight uncanniness in this game made them feel a bit more robotic to me in a visual sense, whether it was intentional or not. But outside of very niche cases like this, a game aggressively going for realism usually lacks the potential spice, emotion, and artistic context that could be provided by a more stylized approach. I mean, just take one look at a game like Hyperdemon to see what I mean. As a matter of fact, you don't even need to start the game to see what's up. Just based on the style of the title screen, you can tell that you're about to step into an experience that is intense, psychedelic, and otherworldly. And as you decide to click the start game button, you're greeted by a still calm, strange world coated in these unusual metallic liquidy textures, warped by the extreme field of view. And as you get closer to the sword floating in front of you, all hell breaks loose as nightmarish demons start hunting you down as you're left to fight for your survival. Every single part of Hyperdemon is dripping in style. It's chaotic, fast-paced, and ethereal, and all of these aspects are amplified by the actual gameplay and vice versa. The uniqueness of the visuals, matched by the unique take on the survival shooter by rewarding uninhibited aggression over all else, combine to create a very effective style that gives Hyperdemon its core identity and allows it to be its own unique thing amongst other first-person shooter survival games. Like in the case of Hyperdemon, style can be used to differentiate oneself in a saturated market of other similar games. Like, let's think about open world games of the 2010s for a second. You have a bunch of games that look roughly the same, that never really make an attempt to break the mold visually, and then comes Breath of the Wild with a completely new, beautiful, cel-shaded, colorful, and lush art style that is so effective that it carved its own lane, causing a trend of games attempting to imitate it. In addition to just being used as something to make a game stand out, style and artistic direction is one of the most overlooked storytelling methods in games that allows the game's creator, the artist, to add context to a world and story without a single line of dialogue. This is demonstrated masterfully in the artistic direction of the 2020 indie RPG Omore, where you play as a young teenaged Shadin traumatized by the loss of a loved one, who every night as he goes to sleep escapes into a fantasy world of his own delusion, an idealized recreation of his childhood where everything is still okay and the people, environments and emotions are covered in this colorful and innocent veneer as he slowly unravels the events that happened in the past. In stark contrast to this, the artistic choices outside of his dream world paint a very different, bleak, and at times painful and disturbing picture. Omore's art style, its use of color, crayon character art, and the way it shifts into surreality in the most intense moments, does a fantastic job of communicating the state of mind of the silent protagonist and adds a layer of emotional depth and rawness that I feel would be missing if it instead decided to go for a more normal presentation. Games like this just hold up better over the years as well. A game like Super Metroid still looks great and successfully delivers that classic Metroid atmosphere today, 30 years later, while something like the original Tomb Raider, which was cutting edge at the time, from around the same time period, looks goofy as hell in retrospect. This is not to say that past their prime realistic graphics can't be enjoyable in the present, but I feel like the reason for appreciating them shifts from the original intention to a more comedic, nostalgia or retro aesthetics driven one. In this sense, a more stylized approach is less risky. By going for your own vision, you get to define what it's supposed to look like, while avoiding the risk of going for something that is unrealistic, like imitating reality. But that is not to say that going for a specific style doesn't come with its own risks. Not everyone is going to like the same thing, and when you stray from the path of what games usually look like, you're always going to alienate some parts of your potential player base, which is why, from the point of sales, going for the safer option can seem more reasonable. Only focusing on style can also leave a game in an awkward place where the style overshadows all other aspects of the game. Like in Sable, which is genuinely one of the prettiest and visually distinct games that I've played. The strong outlines around everything give the game a pretty unique look, and the muted color palette, changing along with the day and night cycle, creates some absolutely stunning moments. Even the intentionally choppy running animations work surprisingly well to create an interesting cartoony effect that fits perfectly with the art style. Despite all this, the contrast of the gorgeous exterior in comparison to the lack of depth in the actual gameplay department with its basic platforming, simple puzzles and fetch quests was so apparent that while playing it, it just left me thinking how good this game could have been if the gameplay mechanics were at the same level as the style of the game. I can also see how some games benefit from a more down-to-earth realistic approach. Like, I can't really imagine what a game like Red Dead 2 would be like if it went a different route instead of the way that it is. And to be honest, the realism works extremely well in that game. The game is fun, the story and acting are among the best in video games, and the graphics never come close to being awkward at any point. One of my favorite details of the game is just how human and real the characters feel. Now, how much of that realness comes from the writing and acting, and how much of it comes from graphics? I'm not sure. Would a character like Arthur Morgan hit the same if the game looked less realistic? It's hard for me to tell since there is only one Red Dead 2. But one thing's for sure, the realism definitely didn't hinder the experience in any way. To reiterate, there is no one right way for a game to look. Everyone likes different things, and there's a place for both types of games, and I doubt that either of them are going anywhere anytime soon. I also kind of might have made the gaming landscape seem more black and white than it is. Just because a game is highly detailed and real looking doesn't mean that it can't have its own style. There are games that do both well enough and are better off for it, like Cyberpunk for example. That doesn't however change just how stale and samey in terms of looks And to be honest, even gameplay, these massive high-budget AAA games have become in the last 2 decades. And from this video, it's probably obvious what kind of approach I personally prefer. I just like variety. I think it's just more fun when a game studio steps outside of the box and really lets their creativity show in all aspects of the game. But to be honest, I don't think much is going to change anytime soon. We've gotten to this point by the way of the success of these formulaic copy-pasty looking big budget titles, and as long as they keep selling, you can be sure that they won't stop making them. But it would be very cool to see one of those big studios get a bit more creative. I mean, Nintendo does it, and pretty much all of their games are timeless because of it. Or maybe some massive leap in video game graphics will happen in the future, and I'll get my mind blown again, like that first time I played Final Fantasy X. I'm not holding my breath though. Anyways, in the end, if a game wants to leave an impact with its style, it needs to have one in the first place. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please leave a like, and if you want to see more stuff like this, please subscribe to my channel. What do you guys think about style and realism in games? I always like reading your takes, so please let me know in the comments. But yeah, thank you again for watching. Have a good one.